Hey guys, how's it going? It's Krista here, and today I'll be making a St. Patrick's Day card with my own DIY rainbow matting for my card front. I'm starting today with a piece of cardstock that's about 6 inches by about 5. And I want to tape that down just because I want to make sure that it doesn't move as I stencil my image onto my card front. For my stencil today, I'm using Simon Says stamp Clover Wreath. And I'm just lining it up on my cardstock how I want it, and I'll tape that down as well. To tape down both my card front as well as my stencil, I'm using some washi tape. But you can use whatever tape you have on hand. I'm using a mini ink blending tool and some Lucky Clover Distress ink. I'm starting with the largest clovers. I'm just making sure to cover the cardstock underneath the stencil window thoroughly with Distress ink. I very easily could have chosen to blend a couple colors in the leaves of the clovers, but that might be an idea for another card. For the smaller clovers, I'm using Mode Lawn Distressed ink. And again, I'm just making sure that I cover the cardstock thoroughly through the stencil window. There are a couple stems that don't have clovers on them, and for that I'm using Evergreen Bough in Distress ink. Again, just using a mini blending tool. There are some little berries on this wreath, and for the berries I chose to bring in some gold. Today I'm using Fine Tech Gold watercolor paints, and the first gold that I'm using today is Arabic gold. If you don't have the Fine Tech pearlescent watercolor paints, you could also use a Perfect Pearl or a gel pen in gold. I really like these watercolor paints because I find that the consistency is easier to control than with a Perfect Pearl. Even though this watercolor paint did run a little bit, and you'll see that when I lift up the stencil, I find that I have more control with the watercolor paints than I do a Perfect Pearl. I find these watercolor paints in particular are easier to mix with the water. To add a little variation to the berries in the wreath, for the berries not attached to the stems, I chose Fine Tech Pearlescent Watercolor Paint in Champagne Silver. I wanted to add a little bit of shimmer to the larger shamrocks. So to the larger shamrocks, I used Fine Tech Pearlescent Watercolor Paint in Silver. I chose to remove the stencil for this because I did try painting the silver over the shamrocks with the stencil on it, and I felt like I wasn't able to reach the entire shamrock with the stencil over my wreath. It was easier to get a more thorough coverage when I removed the stencil. With my clover wreath complete, check out the shine on the larger shamrocks as well as the berries from the Fine Tech Gold watercolor paints. While my clover wreath dries, I'll start the construction of the rainbow mat for my card front. I have a variety of foil metallic card fronts. I picked this up from my local craft store and this came in a pack. There is red, gold, green, blue, indigo, and purple. And just using my paper trimmer, I'm cutting 1/2 inch strips. I'm using the ruler on my paper trimmer to measure 1/2 inch as I cut my strips. I started by cutting 3 strips of each color, and I did end up having some left over. To construct my rainbow, I'm starting with a piece of cardstock that's 6 inches wide and 5.5 inches tall. I'm using liquid adhesive today. You can just as easily use a tape runner or adhesive sheets to adhere your pieces of cardstock to your white piece of cardstock. I decided that I wanted the rainbow to start in the middle with red and work out in each direction following the colors of the rainbow. So on a diagonal, I laid down a piece of red cardstock and flipped it over just to make sure that the corners of the white cardstock are in the middle of the red strip of cardstock as much as possible. If you don't have access to multicolored cardstock or a foil cardstock, you could also use a washi tape if you have access to the colors that you prefer. Now that my red piece of cardstock is aligned as a guide, I'll work my way out each side following the colors of the rainbow. My gold is representing my yellow. And I'll place a piece of gold cardstock on each side of my initial red piece of cardstock. And as I set the strips of paper down, I'm just pushing them together to make sure that there is the least amount of space, but also making sure that the cardstock extends beyond the edge of the white piece of cardstock. Next to my gold cardstock, I'll add the green on either side. Again, making sure that I push each piece of cardstock against the previous piece as much as possible. Next to the green, I'll add the blue piece of cardstock. The indigo piece. And finally, the purple. And at this point, I'm not exactly sure how much of my rainbow background I'll use. So just to make sure that I have enough, I'll continue the rainbow by adding another piece of red. And for the edge of this piece of cardstock, I don't need a whole strip of red, so I'll just cut that in half before gluing it down. Again, I want to make sure that no white is showing through my rainbow background. For a variation of this background, you could always start on one corner with red and work your way through to the other corner, moving through the colors of the rainbow. And the colored strips don't have to be placed on a diagonal either. These strips can be placed on the horizontal or the vertical. I'm going to set this aside to dry, but before I do, I want to make sure that all the strips are adhered. And this is what it looks like from the back. Now that my rainbow cardstock has had a chance to dry completely, I need to cut down the excess strips before I can die cut my cardstock. I'm using my paper trimmer to trim off the excess strips. The trickiest cut is the first cut, as the white piece of square cardstock can't be placed against the edge of the paper trimmer. For my first cut, I lined the wire of my paper trimmer up with the square edge of the white piece of cardstock. Once I've made my first cut, I can then place the white piece of cardstock flush against the paper trimmer for the remaining cuts. Now that the piece of rainbow cardstock is trimmed down square, I can die cut the mat for my card front. Today I'm using the largest rectangle from Lawn Fawn Large Stitched Rectangle Stackable Set, and this rectangle measures 5.5 inches by 4.25 inches. The inner rectangle came from Lawn Fawn Outside In Stitched Rectangle Stackable Set. Once the rectangle dies were taped down to create a frame, I ran that through my die cut machine. I didn't run my piece of cardstock through my die cut machine enough. I would recommend running this piece of cardstock through the die cut machine at least 2 or 3 times to get a clean cut. And now that my clover wreath is dry, I'll cut that down to size using Lawn Fawn Outside In Stitched Rectangle Stackables. This is the largest die in the set, and it measures 5.25 inches by 4 inches. After I've run that through my die cut machine, I'll adhere my wreath to my rainbow mat using liquid adhesive. This piece of cardstock was left over from another project. It was cut using a window die in the Lawn Fawn Fancy Box die set. I'll secure that down with the magnets in my stamping tool so I can emboss my sentiment, St. Patrick's Day, onto the front. This is a tight fit and not exactly perfect, but I do like the shape of this die cut. The sentiment I'm using today is Happy St. Patrick's Day, both from Lawn Fawn's Happy 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 add-on clear stamps and dies. I'll make sure that's straight in my stamping tool before coming in with some Versamark ink. I'll close that stamp over and add some Ranger White embossing powder before setting it with my heat tool. For the Happy in Happy St. Patrick's Day, I'll die cut that using the Happy 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 add-on die. I did die cut Happy from some leftover rainbow cardstock, but I decided that I wanted a different spectrum. So I die cut it again from the red, green, and gold portion that I felt were a little bit more St. Patrick's Day colors. I'll adhere the happy to the piece of craft cardstock first. And then I'll adhere the entire piece of craft cardstock to my card front using some liquid adhesive. I'll double check that my sentiment is straight using a T ruler. And finally, I'll adhere my card front to a 5.5 by 4.25 card base using liquid adhesive. That concludes today's card. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.